Hello, wellness students, and welcome to your third presentation this week. And it is your final lecture presentation for the semester. So, congratulations, you just have this one to go. And in this particular presentation, we're closing out the section on emotional or mental wellness with this topic of mental illness and disorders. And first of all, one thing I want to let you know that is that the information that I'm providing for you, I've gotten it from the National Institute of Mental Health, and the terminology that's being used in this presentation is the terminology used by the National Institute of Mental Health. Some of the terminology I'm not incredibly fond of, um, but just for the sake of being consistent and kind of lining up with that particular uh, body and website, I've stuck with a lot of the same language. Now, the purpose of this presentation is definitely just to encourage more awareness and understanding. Actually, we're going to be talking about two conditions that fall into this category of mental illness or disorders, um, anxiety and depression. So, the purpose of this is just, again, it's to increase awareness, to also help you maybe develop a little better understanding of these two issues. Um, Definitely, this presentation is not at all about helping you diagnose yourself or, to assume things. It's not at all related to that. So we're going to go ahead and just get going. Okay, so according to the National Institute of Mental Health, mental disorders, and I would encourage you just to think, especially maybe a type of depression or anxiety, is it's considered the leading cause of disability in the United States and Canada for ages 15 through 44. And when we're talking about disability, we're talking about when you're no longer able to, for example, work or perform your responsibilities at work, or maybe in some way just kind of function, ability to perform just um, things that are necessary for daily functioning. So, this is a really telling statistic that it's considered the leading cause. It's physical injuries aren't the leading cause, or physical health problems not the leading cause. Mental health related challenges are the leading cause. And then, another statement that I thought was worth entering in here is that, many people do suffer from more than one mental disorder, and you're probably going to hear me transitioning over into the phrase mental challenge um, at any given time. You're going to see as we go through this that the percentages are actually pretty significant uh, for both anxiety and depression. Okay, so I think this is one way that we can really clear up, well, what the heck does this mean? A mental illness or a mental disorder. What exactly um, does that entail? And so if you look at this second bullet point, it says mental disorders. And again, this is from the National Institute of Mental Health. They're health conditions. So just think of these as health conditions. But with these particular conditions, they're characterized by alterations. That means changes, changes in thinking, changes in mood, or changes in behavior. So a mental disorder is a health condition that's characterized by a change in thinking, mood, or behavior. or it could be a combination of them. And those changes in thinking, mood, and behavior are associated with distress or impaired functioning. So, that inability maybe to navigate daily life the way, you really need to or really want to, or the inability maybe to continue with your work or your school responsibilities. So hopefully that maybe makes things a bit clearer. Now, this first condition, anxiety, it is the most commonly occurring mental health condition. And you'll see 18% up in the corner. The exact statistic is actually it's 18 point something, but I just put 18% here, which is at any given time, what this means is that at any given time, about 18% of our population is diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Okay, so hear that clearly, about 18% diagnosed. The percentage of people that are actually suffering from an anxiety disorder is probably higher than that. So let's give this some perspective. If you're sitting in a classroom with 30 students, if the classroom is representative of this statistic, approximately 5 of the 30 students in that classroom will have been diagnosed with anxiety. So, I know one of the things, because, anxiety was something that I struggled a lot with, especially during my 40s. One of the things I think that can be so hard about experiencing one of these conditions is that there can be a tendency to feel like you're the only one. And so the real reason that I like for you guys to be aware of the statistic is to just have an understanding if any of you are affected. Oh my gosh, you certainly are not the only one. There are a fair number of other people out there walking around probably with you that are going through the same thing. So you're definitely not alone. Now, anxiety, let's just look at this a little more closely. It says it's a condition characterized by apprehension, tension, or uneasiness. And, I think the way to maybe sum this up is just to say anxiety is a condition in which the kind of overriding emotion is fear. Anxiety is a really fear-based condition. Now, there is a difference between feeling anxious and having anxiety. All of us from time to time will feel anxious, will feel some tension or uneasiness or nervousness or apprehension. Having anxiety is it's a condition, and it disrupts your ability to function in daily life. And so, I want you to be, also really clear about that. Now, to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, diagnosis is usually based on several things, but one of them is duration. How long has this been going on with you? A lot of times with diagnosis, in order for it to be made, you have to have been um, uh, experiencing the symptoms for it could be a minimum of 3 months. It depends a little on the particular disorder. But these are symptoms that have kind of been unremitting. They've been kind of continuous for a longer period of time. And the second criteria usually has to do with intensity. The intensity of the symptoms is severe, and it's interrupting your ability to function in daily life. Okay, and there are actually a number of different anxiety disorders. They have, with each anxiety disorder, there are some kind of hallmark symptoms that go with each. For example, some different anxiety disorders are generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. Those are all considered anxiety disorders. But there is this common thread that does kind of persist through all of them. And this is it. In general, some symptoms that occur with all the anxiety disorders is excessive irrational fear, um, and also dread. And dread, what that's about is, with an anxiety disorder, there's a tendency to kind of walk through the day and you just feel fearful. And that fear, there's no reason to necessarily be feeling it. Your good mind is still there, but you just feel fearful and you can't seem to get rid of it. So life can begin to feel so overwhelming. It can be difficult to rally up to do the simplest task. Maybe it's just to go check your mail. And because life feels so overwhelming and you're so fear ridden, there will be a tendency to dread most things because it all just feels so hard. So, a couple of things here that I just want to reinforce is, again, there's a difference between feeling anxious and having anxiety. Having anxiety or an anxiety disorder is, it's definitely a health condition. It disrupts your ability to function in life. And life in general is just going to feel incredibly overwhelming. So I wanted to just show you one specific anxiety disorder, and it's probably the most common, and it gets referred to as generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. And if you look at how it's diagnosed when someone spends at least 6 months worrying excessively about a number of everyday problems. And it goes on to say, that people can't really, that experiences can't really get rid of their concerns, their worries. They generally will realize that their anxiety is out of proportion to what the situation is, or you could say that their fear, a person will recognize that that fear doesn't quite make sense. And then, too, this last one I think is a real good one to just kind of help you understand what the experience would feel like, is that sometimes just the thought of getting through the day produces anxiety. It's life just feels overwhelming. Now, some specific symptoms that go with generalized anxiety disorder, and I've picked this one out because it's probably the most common, and also, these particular symptoms that go with generalized anxiety disorder are probably going to be present with the other anxiety disorders. Um, so some symptoms: difficulty just relaxing, a tendency to startle easily, difficulty concentrating, insomnia, fatigued. For those of you that have experienced having anxiety, you're probably very familiar with tiredness and the fatigue that can go with it. Headaches and muscle tension can be a part of it. Trembling, twitching, irritability, sweating, having to go to the bathroom frequently. That can be another symptom. There are a lot of other symptoms. What's being listed here, though, the one symptom that I'm not seeing, in bold, that again I want to emphasize: feeling overwhelmed and feeling fearful. And it's a type of fear that, again, it doesn't make sense, but it's there. So these are some typical symptoms. And you know what I'd like to just to kind of end this piece on anxiety is to tell you that if you're going through these feelings, if you're having these symptoms, and if they've been present for for any length of time at all, even if it's just been a couple of weeks, go and see a doctor. And through your doctor, probably what they're going to want to do is run some tests to make sure there isn't a physical reason that you could be experiencing this. And, then refer you to, for example, a counselor, a mental health professional. It's really important to address this early on. Um, if you address anxiety early on, your chances of learning to cope with it, to manage it, and hopefully move through it are really improved. If you sit back and don't address it and don't do anything about it, there can be a tendency for anxiety to actually get worse. Remember, it's a health condition. It isn't something that someone's choosing, and it isn't something that you could tell someone, hey, just rally up and get over it. It's not like that. So, getting treatment or seeking help early is really, really important so that it doesn't progress and get worse. Some people who experience anxiety, if it's untreated or if it's not being addressed, can find their lives getting very, very small. It can feel overwhelming to leave the home or leave the apartment. And, it can be pretty easy to start dropping commitments in life and just bowing out of a lot of things. So this is something serious to really address. Okay, and the second mental health condition that I wanted to be sure and spend a bit of time with you on is depression. Now, I have a lot of students who think that the incidence of depression is probably higher than anxiety. But what the statistics now show is that with depression, about 9.5% of our population is diagnosed with some type of a depressive illness. And we're going to look at a couple of those in a second. Now, the thing though is with depression is a lot of people that experience depression do not seek treatment. And so this percentage is probably low. It's probably higher than this. But what we have at least, in recent years is this statistic of 9.5%, anxiety at 18%. So anxiety seems to show up, maybe twice as frequently as depression. And with depression, you're looking at almost 1 in 10 people actually being, diagnosed with depression. That's the only way we can get these statistics is if people have, you know, um, went and sought help and they get diagnosed. So, that's something to keep in mind. Now, there are different types of depression, and I've listed just a couple that I think are probably the most common occurring. One is major depression, which I think a lot of us are more familiar with that. We see it, whether it's in programming or it's more visible. It's more visible in general, in society when someone's experiencing major depression. It's very disabling. Um, and again, it isn't at all one of those things where you can just rally up and get yourself out of it. It's a real stuck place. And once again, there's a difference between feeling depressed and having depression. So be sure and understand that. The symptoms for depression, I've got a list I'm going to show you in just a second, but they're a real combination of mental and emotional symptoms and also physical symptoms. Now, there's this other type of depression that is probably not as visible, and it's called dysthymia. Think of dysthymia as more so a low grade depression but it gets classified as a condition because it is chronic, it's long term. You may be able to function in life, but you're just in general not functioning as well as you could be. With dysthymia, I know based on what I've read, sometimes they feel that sometimes it actually begins more so in your early years, but then it just persists kind of through life. And so I think dysthymia could be a bit tricky because for someone who maybe develops it when they're very young, they come to learn that that's just kind of their normal. But it's also, it's considered a mental health condition. Now, some symptoms of depression, the mood symptoms, persistent sadness, anxiety, anxiousness can also go with depression. And in fact, it's pretty common for people to have anxiety and depression at the same time. This feeling of just kind of an empty mood, feeling hopeless, your thinking patterns. Remember, there's a change in mood, behavior, and thinking patterns with these conditions, and your thinking patterns potentially become even more negative or pessimistic. Um, Guilt, worthlessness, helplessness. Um, there's also loss of interest in activities that you may normally have been interested in, or a loss of pleasure in those activities um, or hobbies you may have been interested in. Low energy, low physical, and I think you could also say mental energy. So decreased energy, more fatigue. There's going to be, the difficulty with concentrating, maybe remembering or making decisions, sleep problems. Sleep problems are also going to be present with anxiety. The thing that I think is interesting about depression is one of the symptoms is early morning awakening. It talks about insomnia or oversleeping, but early morning awakening. And I've read that sometimes when this health condition is present, there can be a tendency to be waking up at about 2 a.m. And it may not be that you stay awake, but just waking up, it's 2 a.m., going back to sleep. Um, Other symptoms with depression can include appetite change, weight change, um, thoughts of death or suicide, suicide attempts, restlessness, irritability. And then those physical symptoms, you know, there can be a wide range of them, but there are several listed here: headaches, digestive disorders, chronic pain. Now, as I mentioned with anxiety, it's equally important if you're experiencing symptoms of depression to go and ask for help. Um, Start with your doctor because there are some physical types of things that could be occurring that would also kind of manifest themselves looking like depression. So you would definitely want to see your doctor, and then hopefully from that point you could get a referral to a mental health care provider. So, I bet that every person knows someone who has experienced severe depression and probably knows someone who's experienced having anxiety. And I also know anytime I'm teaching a class that I'm going to have, you know, minimum of 5 students in that class who are experiencing depression or anxiety. So these conditions um, they're felt to be much more present these days in our society. And I won't get into theorizing about why that may be the case, but they're conditions to take seriously. They are not a sign of weakness. They're a sign that, hey, I need to make some adjustments. And the first thing I need to do is go to my doctor, maybe checked out physically, and ask for a referral. Or I suppose you could start with a counselor or a therapist, and they're probably going to ask you to get a physical. So I hope maybe that this has provided you with some clarity, maybe some increased clarity about anxiety and depression, and that you are now more fully aware of if you have ever struggled with this or if you currently are, you're not alone, and how important it is to go ahead and take that step of asking for help. Um, and this is, I always have students ask me, does it last forever? If you have anxiety, will you always have it? If you're experiencing depression, will you always have it? And how I kind of like to answer that question, I'm not an expert. I've studied, in this area a lot, and I've also, like I mentioned, had a pretty long period of my life that I struggled with anxiety. Um, Based on what I've read and also on personal experience, I think a lot of it depends on, um, are you doing everything you possibly can to treat the condition? Um, One thing that I've learned about myself is that um, while these days, and I'm going to knock on wood, I'm in a really good place when it comes to anxiety. I also, though, know that it's something that I will always have to pay attention to, and that it's really, really important for me to double down on my efforts to take good care of myself. So, my personal experience with anxiety has been that yes, it can um, greatly subside and potentially go away. But how we care for ourselves when something like this comes up in our life ends up being the really important piece. So, okay. So this was your final lecture, and I hope you guys are all hanging in there, getting ready for the final exams that you might have next week. Remember, in this class, you do have a final exam. It will be 70 questions, multiple choice, true, false. It is cumulative. It covers, the whole semester. As a class, and I have two classes. Both classes, in general, have been doing extremely well with their exams. And so, hang in there. You've just got one more. Finish strong with this one, and I'll probably be recording a message for you again next week. All right, take good care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon.